Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be discussing this post that has been going around on TikTok right now. This kind of sentiment, which is this idea that the sole state of publishing lies directly on the shoulders of Booktok, is not something new. Anyone that has been on Booktok for anything longer than 2 weeks has probably seen some sort of iteration of this kind of sentiment, and it's usually based in this kind of elitism and also misogyny. But there was something very specific about this post which made me really want to unpack and maybe just do a deep dive as to why there seems to be this inexplicable link between dark romance and Booktok. Dark romance, by genre definition, is graphic, explicit, and extremely polarizing. So I just wanted to understand why it was that this kind of content is doing well on TikTok and why there seems to be this link between Booktok and dark romance. The way that the TikTok algorithm works is by making sure that the majority of their users are engaged. And therefore, what the majority deems is interesting and something of value is what gets pushed to the top of the algorithm. So, if the majority of TikTok users are from America and the majority of TikTok users that are within the Booktok subsection of TikTok, then we can understand by default that the majority of creators and also the audience that makes up Booktok is white women from America. And just like the world is unable to escape American foreign policy, we too are unable to escape Americans' whims, fancies, and interests on social media. Before 2020, I would describe myself as very much an isolated reader. I was someone that approached the reading space in a very simplified way, which is that I would go to the library or I'd go to the bookstore, I'd read the back of a book, and if I was interested, I'd read it, and that was the beginning and end. I never had any sort of Goodreads, I have never been in any sort of bookish community before, and so when Booktok emerged in 2020, and we were in the middle of lockdown, I thought that it was incredible. There was a place on the internet now that had these amazing fun books available, there were friends to be had, and there was just a lot of funny content which I just never experienced and I thought was amazing. And I think this might be the experience of a lot of readers, in that they just didn't have a bookish community surrounding them, and so the Booktok app basically filled that void. And so back then, it didn't take a lot to convince me to do anything at all. In fact, one line from a book would be enough to convince me to read. And so that ended up coming back to haunt me in the end, and I no longer do that. But yeah, that was such a fun time, and I feel very nostalgic and protective of that time. And I also feel like publishing and those that enjoy reading really do owe Booktok a lot of thanks, because without Booktok, the publishing industry as it stands today would be a completely different space. There were a lot of concerns actually pre-pandemic about where physical books were going to go, and so I think if we do have access to these physical books right now, it's very much testament and in thanks to Booktok, and the pros of the platform definitely outweigh the cons. So I'm just going to put that there before we start delving into the different areas of Booktok. As I mentioned earlier, there is definitely a price to pay when you decide to buy an entire series off of one line with a really good song in the background. And I learned that very early on through my friends actually. My friends really experienced this thing where they, from a very aesthetic video which they thought was about fantasy books, they ended up buying titles such as Den of Vipers, which is an extremely graphic, dark romance novel. So from the very inception of Booktok, these kinds of titles have always been very much sought after and very platformed. So there seems to be a link between Booktok itself and these books, whether booktokers and Booktok like to admit that or not. In order to understand the interests surrounding these types of books and these titles, I really wanted to look into some of the history of romance in general. In 1972, Kathleen Woodward published The Flame and the Flower, and this was the first type of genre-bending romance of its time that included explicit material, and this created a whole new subgenre of romance called bodice rippers. This was a huge change within the publishing industry that had not published this type of content before, and I really wanted to look into kind of the socio-political factors that might have influenced Woodward to publish this kind of book. So at the time, in the 1970s, America, especially middle-class white Americans, were going through this kind of new age of conservative populism. This demographic were very much bored and just over the hippies, who they thought was anyone that had protested against the Vietnam War, and it was kind of their way of pushing back against a system that they thought no longer served them. And this was also a time in America's history when there was a lot of unemployment, a lot of political unrest, and as I said before, this growing sentiment of conservatism. And it's really interesting because where have we seen these kinds of unemployment, a lot of protests, and political unrest before, other than in 2020? I think back then we were definitely given the worst hand of cards when it comes to politicians, from Boris Johnson in the UK to Trump in the US, and whilst public health was deteriorating in front of our eyes, we were dealing with all these other issues, which is this kind of new wave consciousness and the Black Lives Matters protests and unemployment and work from home, and also just trying to survive in a pandemic. Those factors really is what made TikTok so popular. In June of 2020 to July of 2020, the TikTok app saw a 45% increase in viewership and engagement. And that kind of overnight or in a month success just doesn't happen in tech. So I think that a lot of people were looking for escapism, and so maybe the reason why Woodward decided to publish a bodice ripper back in the 1970s is very much the same reason as to why American women are interested in dark romance novels in 2020. Something that was slightly different to the 1970s in 2020 was Trump. And Trump really brought in this new ideology, which is this far-right ideology based in xenophobia, a sort of Christian nationalism, and this link to evangelicalism, and he almost merged the church and the state in a way that hadn't really been done since before the 1950s. I think this was also a huge contributing factor to the interest in these kinds of novels that is still very much of interest to people today in 2024. Trump at that point in 2020 had already been in power for about 4 years. There had been this sort of legislative attack against all women's rights. So this framed from all the way from abortion rights to basic things like employment rights. And I think this attack on women is very much something that has influenced art. When Booktok became a thing, there were a few books that really garnered that engagement from white women in America, and those books became the algorithm's darlings, I would say. And that was stuff like It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover, Of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas, Ugly Love. Hoover alone has sold over 14.3 million copies, and I think a lot of that is due to the popularity of them on the app. White American women engage with this content. The reason I say engage rather than enjoy is that the engagement is very polarizing. Still now there are regular debates about whether dark romance should exist at all, And because of how polarizing the content is, there seems to be one section of people that completely love this genre and they find everything that's being written empowering and a way to regain some kind of control over their sexuality. And on the other side, you have people that are completely disgusted that these kinds of things exist and they can't believe that these are things that people post on the app. And the reason why that does well on TikTok is because that is how the algorithm thrives. When there is conversation that's happening, when there is conflict that's happening, you can almost guarantee that a post is going to do well. And this creates a really interesting relationship between the content creator and dark romance itself, because content creators on Booktok know that if they decide to post something about a dark romance novel, then this is going to have rising comments and therefore the algorithm will reward it and the video will probably perform a little bit better. And this kind of creates this perpetual relationship between dark romance novels and the booktoker, because both parties want engagement and both parties want the content to do well. That relationship is really what serves and helps these novels reach their levels in popularity. This is why when new users are deciding to look into Booktok, they are first fed into dark romance. It's because of how much engagement this kind of content makes on the app, and that's how the app functions. I decided to have a look at what shows up when you search up the hashtag Booktok on TikTok, and the third video, so the third video that TikTok is pushing out right now is one about a dark romance novel, and I think it currently sits at over 1 million views. So as you can see, this is very much the type of content you can expect to see. In order for us to really understand white Americans' attitudes and views towards these kinds of novels, we really need to look into and their lives in general. So the first thing I really wanted to know was access to sex education in the US. And from the research that I did, only 38% of high schoolers in America have access to sex ed. And that is shockingly low. As a British person, I didn't even think that this was something that people debated or didn't have access to naively. It's something that I was very much a part of. I think we started it in year 6, and I think you're about 11 when you do it in year 6, and then we did it again in year 9, and then we did it again in year 11. So sex education was very much just a part of the schooling system. I didn't realize that this was something that a lot of Americans didn't have access to. And the most disturbing part of the 38% statistic is that within that percentage there are many schools that are still teaching the abstinence only curricula, which is based on the purity culture movement and the teachings of the church. This is something else that I think has really impacted the way that white American women view sex and relationships, and a huge part of why this culture on Booktok I think exists right now. The other part of it that I really wanted to look into for this is that because 1 in 4 white American women identify as Christians, I wanted to look at how purity culture has affected their attitudes and their beliefs towards sex and sexuality, and those kinds of things. And the purity movement was something that emerged in the 1990s. This was a reactionary movement to the sex revolution that was happening earlier, and also the scandals that Bill Clinton had gotten himself into, and then surprisingly enough the response to the amount of Viagra that was being consumed by the average American. I think the church basically came up with this idea that we really need to hammer in purity and this idea of chasteness and virginity to guard our women. And the things that I have been reading about purity culture, you guys, I think are gonna scar me for the rest of my life. As you guys can probably tell, I'm very Muslim, practicing Muslim, and Muslims also do not have sex before marriage. We were basically told that sex was something that we should have in marriage, and that the reason for that was that there were financial and emotional responsibilities that came with sex, and you just weren't ready for them until you got married. And also, for us, the idea of sex are very much private. This isn't something that you would discuss with the community or anything like that. This is, you know, your relationship with God and something for you to reconcile on your own. There isn't this kind of public reckoning that seems to exist within the Christian culture around purity. So I wanted to put that in there just in case you guys were wondering where my background is in terms of all of this. Back to purity culture. So some of the things that I've been learning about have been so terrifying, you guys. The purity culture movement started in the 1990s. And this resulted in many women being uninformed about what sex actually was. They were confused about their sexual feelings, and they were naive as to how to protect themselves against things like pregnancies and STDs, just because there was no information about this. And they also were not given any sort of information about healthy relationships and what those look like. The purity movement very much found its way quite scarily into pop culture. The Jonas Brothers are famously known for wearing their purity rings, and the idea of abstinence was very much portrayed as the cool thing within media. When reading about this, the lack of sex education for the average white woman in America, and subsequently all kinds of women in America, is done purposefully to try and push this purity culture agenda. The idea here is that the less that you know about the topic, the less that you'll ask questions, the less likely you are to commit the act, etc., etc. Obviously, this isn't what ends up happening. It just means that people are unaware with what is and isn't happening with their own bodies. Virginity pledges are something that are very normal within church and school. This is very much a public affair, and many girls as young as 8 wear badges, and some of the badges are absolutely crazy. There's this one quote here, you guys, that I think I'm probably going to think about forever. I've never seen anything like this. On the badge, it's literally written, "You are like a beautiful rose. Each time you engage in premarital sex, a precious petal is stripped away. Don't leave your future husband holding a bare stem. Abstain." That is literally what's written on this badge that someone as young as 8 needs to wear. And basically, this message is alluding to the idea that your worth as a girl, as a young woman, or even as a child, is dependent on whether or not you've decided to have sex outside the bounds of marriage, which is absolutely terrifying. And that is one of the parts of the messaging that is repeated over and over and over again, which is that with women's bodies, the purity of it is very much dependent on whether you conform, and if you don't, then you're impure. I will say that as a British person, kind of reading about this on the outside looking in, it's very Margaret Thatcher's Handmaid's Tale. It's actually quite hard to believe that somewhere that purports itself as the greatest country in the world could still have these kinds of teachings and ideologies in schools. How does all of this purity culture and sex education and all of these things link back to the average white American woman on Booktok and their enjoyment and engagement of dark romance? One of my theories as to why this demographic is so drawn to dark romance is because of how unapologetic it is and how proud it is to exist within the romance space. These books go against all of the puritanical teachings that they were forced into when they were younger, and this escapism for them is also an act of rebellion against the system that they had to grow up through. I also did a little bit of research on Reddit, and I found that a lot of women that went through or are going through things like domestic abuse enjoy the fantastical elements of the dark romance. So because there is that violence of their real life within the novels and the content, they are able to escape in a more realistic way. These novels provide them with this kind of escapism as it eroticizes their current situation and allows them to fantasize and believe in this kind of happily ever after, and that's what they enjoy about the subgenre. I think something I definitely want to focus on here is the rebellious act that reading this kind of content is for this demographic, and how this kind of rebellion might be a two-pronged approach, one against the culture and that society that they've grown up in, but also against the household and their particular family dynamic, because of the rising amount of conservative beliefs that American men are having. There was a study done recently which found that women and men are very much divided when it comes to their political beliefs, with men leaning more right than even some boomers and leaning towards the left. So to push back against the confines that society and the nuclear families have put on them, these women flock towards dark romance. Never mind that these titles have usually been associated with things like ableism, Islamophobia, and all sorts of other isms. It doesn't seem to matter to the white liberal. For them, true liberation can definitely be found here, because in this text they are able to have that reclamation of autonomy and sexuality, which they believe is the be-all and end-all of liberation. To me, this foundational idea of liberation definitely comes from second wave feminism, which is now known as liberal feminism. And the most common slogan from this feminist ideology is "my body, my choice." This slogan has definitely been co-opted by white liberal feminists who use it to push agendas that most women have never asked for, such as free the nipple, which did nothing to address the amount of sexual violence that women go through. In fact, during the pandemic, the World Health Organization literally said that there was another shadow pandemic happening because of the amount of violence that was happening against women. Bearing in mind that prior to the pandemic, 1 in 3 women were already experiencing physical or sexual abuse. White liberal feminists also have a particular disdain for Muslim women, and I think you can definitely see this in the political ideologies that they choose to push forward and the ones that they choose not to speak about at all. So for example, there was this post by Pregnant Skewed back in 2022 where they posted about Free Iran, and this was because of the death of Mahsa Amini, who died because of police brutality due to the fact that she was wearing her hijab wrong. Definitely not saying that this was not an important cause. No one should ever die because of what they're wearing. But what I will say is that 2 years later and 50,000 people dead later, and this is what you post about what's happening in Palestine, about Muslim women that do wear the veil, is very telling. So there's only one type of Middle Easterner that you're okay with surviving, and it's the one that has the same ideology that you do. And so people that don't have the same ideology that you do are not worthy of life. For the liberal feminist, the ability to express their sexuality is second to none. There are no other human rights or things that they want to fight for apart from this. And the reason I'm saying this is because of what's happening in Palestine right now and what white liberal Zionists have said about the women in Gaza. So it has been a very common saying recently actually, which is that, oh, do you like wearing bikinis on the beach? And if you do, you're not gonna like Gaza. Basically saying that if there is a group of people in the world that are going through something as terrible as what's happening in Palestine right now, that they are not worthy of being advocated for because you might not be able to wear a bikini at their local beach. Really think about it, you guys. It's actually insane. I think this ideology is very attractive to those that have lived under purity culture. The reason I'm saying that is because that slogan, "My body, my choice," is actually revolutionary to these people who have never been given the choice when it comes to their own bodies and autonomy, and because of their whiteness, they simply don't have any other issues. It allows them to think that within dark romance, which is supported by the liberal feminist ideology, they will find liberation, can even perceive themselves as revolutionaries that has gone against all societal norms. So within this genre, they are able to balance this line between self-pleasure and this ability to self-inflate as this heroine that's fighting the good fight. And they have found everything they could ever want within this genre. Those of us that don't consume dark romance, or those of us that don't prefer to read in that genre, have been subjected to graphic content. And this was something that I was getting a few comments on when I made my TikTok. And I think the commentary that I wanted to include here is that this is a community. Nothing that you do is only going to affect you. When you post things online and you post things within a community, we are going to engage. Those things are going to be of interest to a lot of people, and what you do within a community affects the rest of us. And so yes, when you're posting very graphic, very intimate scenes, then that is going to have an effect on the rest of us, and it does it encroaches on us because of how the algorithm works. And I also think that this really opens up a lot of questions surrounding consent, surrounding minors. At the end of the day, TikTok was originally a children's platform, and a plethora of other things, such as younger people are being pushed out of third spaces, where are they going to go? Are they going to be pushed out of Booktok because of the mature books that are at the forefront when you enter the space? Or even worse, are they going to conform with the algorithm and potentially engage with something they simply aren't ready for? And I think a lot of this is to do with the etiquette of the dark romance community and what they can do in order to mitigate this kind of harm that could potentially be happening to the rest of us that share this community with them. There are also questions about when will "is it spicy" comments stop. And the other thing is that individualism, unfortunately, is a central part of Americans. And so until white American women decide that there are other issues than misogyny, I fear that these questions will probably go unanswered. All this to say, dark romance is a part of the Booktok community, and it is a large part, whether everyone likes to admit it or not. And that BIPOC creators stand as bastions against the waves of white mediocrity that happens within the bookish space. And to them I say, I love you, I see you, I am you, and to keep up the good work. And I have loved being part of the community. I know BookTube doesn't seem to like us as much, but I'm hoping to make a space on here too. And that's my essay, you guys. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you sitting down with me and listening to me talk for this long. I hoped you learned something. Please let me know if you agree, if you disagree, what your thoughts and feelings were. Thank you so much, and I will see you guys soon. Bye guys.